Good afternoon, students. Today we are having our fifth lecture, which is control of motor activity by the central nervous system, physiology of the autonomic nervous system. Today we are going to talk about the main types of motor activity of the human body and integration of different parts of the central nervous system in regulation of motor activity, motor functions of the spinal cord and brainstem, cerebral cortex, basal ganglia, and cerebellum, anatomical physiological characteristics of the peripheral part of the autonomic nervous system, synaptic transmission in the autonomic nervous system, and higher autonomic centers and their role in control of internal organs. So now let's talk about the main types of motor activity. There are three groups of them, and all coordination in our body involves participation of all departments of the central nervous system. So let's talk about the first type, which is reflexes or unconditioned reflex motor responses. This group of motor activity is the least complicated, realized mainly by reflexes, which are locked up at the level of the spinal cord, but is constantly corrected by the information from the propriocenters of the muscles and tendons. Postural and vestibular reflexes are the examples of this type of reflexes. And these reflexes are also receiving corrected information, sensory information from the visual and vestibular analysis. And as a result, person is able to correct its optimal position of his body in the space. But if such person is in the dark space or the person is blind, then this motor activity is corrected by the tactile sensory information, which helps us to change our optimal position in case of dark. Second type is consciously movement or voluntary controlled movements. They are the most complicated form of motor activity. They require participation of the cerebral cortex and can begin without external stimulus. The basal ganglia play important role in these reflexes because of automatism. So basal ganglia is responsible for automatism when a person is training its motor activity. And the examples can be playing piano, cycling, dancing, etc. And the third type of motor activity is stereotypic movement or rhythmic movements. It's a combination of first and second type. It begins due to the signal from the cerebral cortex, but when it started, it is supported by the excitation of the neural chain, which is called central pattern generator. This chain is formed by the help of interneurons, by the connection of interneurons with motor neuron, and is controlled by the cerebral cortex. Example of this type of motor activity is walking and running. As I said previously, all departments of the central nervous system involves in the motor activity of our body. So we can classify all these departments into the three levels. First one is the spinal cord, second brainstem and cerebellum, and the third one is cerebral cortex and basal ganglia, which are responsible for conscious voluntary movement and the automatism. Thalamus is important structure in regulation of motor activity because it receives information, processes it, and send it to the afferent pathways to the spinal cord, basal ganglia, and cerebellum back to the cerebral cortex. Only conditioned voluntary motor activity acquires participation of the cerebral cortex. Unconditioned reflex motor do not require involvement of cerebral cortex. Spinal cord, cerebellum, and brainstem receive sensory information from muscle spindles, Golgi tendon organs, and joint receptors. Basically, brainstem provides postural reflexes and reflex reactions of the eyes and hands based on information received from these receptors, proprioceptors. In this case, motor nuclei of the brainstem receive corrective efferent information from the cerebellum. Conscious movement is much more complicated than unconscious and needs integration work of cerebral cortex, cerebellum, and basal ganglia. And together they are responsible for decision making and planning based on the information received from the receptors, beginning of movement, and execution of movement. The cerebral cortex is the highest center for the regulation of motor activity, and it's responsible for decision-making, planning, and beginning of movement. Planning the motions requires awareness of the position of the body and its parts in space, and understanding of its mechanism and understanding of the consequences of execution of movement. Structure which responsible for this is prefrontal and associative areas of the cortex, which send information to the basal ganglia. Then it returns to the premotor zone, which is associative motor regions of the cortex. And from there, it sends to the primary motor zone, which is anterior central gyrus, which then send information and perform movement by the help of corticospinal pathway and brainstem. Another copy of this information is sent to the cerebellum. And in the process of movement, the afferent information from the proprioceptors enters the spinal cord and cerebellum and is used to correct movement if it's needed. Now let's talk about the exact role of spinal cord in the regulation of motor activity. So, as I said previously, it is spinal cord, it is the lowest level from the hierarchy of the motor centers of the central nervous system, and cerebral cortex is the highest. By itself, spinal cord cannot provide any primitive forms of body movement. But by the help of motor spinal cord, we have direct access to the skeletal muscles, and we perform our movement. So, in other words, higher centers is able to perform its action by the help of the spinal cord. So, in this term, spinal cord looks like the mediator, which performs function, movement, which is planned and was made as a decision in the cerebral cortex. So in the anterior horns of the spinal cord, there are two types of motor neurons. First one is alpha motor neuron, which ends at the extrafusal skeletal muscle fibers, and gamma motor neuron, which ends at the intrafusal fibers. But the majority of the spinal cord neurons is represented by the interneuron, which together with the sensory and motor neurons form numerous chains and helps to perform precise movement and innervate responsible muscles. So there are three types of reflexes performed by the help of spinal cord. These are myotatic reflexes or stretch reflexes, withdrawal flexor reflexes, and inverse myotatic reflexes or tendon reflexes. Let's talk about the myotatic or stretch reflexes. They occurs in response to the stretching of muscle, which it gives his name. And when muscle is stretched, action potential is generated and then is transmitted through the afferent nerve, which then is sent to the spinal cord and stimulate alpha motor neurons of the corresponding segment of the spinal cord. And as a result, we will observe contraction of the muscle agonist with the same relaxation of muscle antagonists. When tension in the intrafusal fibers of the muscles decreases, then action potential will ceases and reflex will stop. Example of such myotatic stretch reflexes can be knee reflex, which is a part of routine neurological examination. So let's watch a video about it.
This video demonstrates
Okay. So once again, when by the help of neurological hammer, which is struck on the tendon of the forehead muscle of the thigh, we can observe rapid extension of the forehead muscle, resulting in a rapid contraction with a characteristic typing of the leg in the knee joint. If the external load is applied to the muscle, is applied for a long period of time, then there is a simultaneous excitation of gamma motor neurons, along with the stimulation of the alpha motor neuron, which maintains this tension in the central nervous, in the central part of the intrafusal fibers of the proprioceptors, and it leads to the excitation of the extrafusal fibers. Next type of the reflexes is tendon reflexes from the Golgi organs. It occurs in response to the stretching of the tendons during strong muscle contraction. This type of reflexes is like opposite to the stretch reflexes. Why it calls reversed myotatic reflex? Because the primary goal of this reflex is to prevent excessive contraction and prevent rupture of ligaments and tendons. So it helps to relax muscle antagonist and contraction of muscle agonist. And the third one is protective flexor withdrawal reflexes. It arises when the stimulus, when the pain stimulus affects the skin or subcutaneous areas. They cause the activation of the flexor muscle with the simultaneous relaxation of the extensor muscle of the same side of the body, of the ipsilateral side, same side. And the result of this reflex is the withdrawal of the limb from the object causing pain. In case of this picture, it's a leg, but usually it can be finger when we are touching something hot, for example. And the expediency of such reflex reaction is to preserve body balance when its weight is transferred to the intact limb. Now let's talk about the motor centers of the brainstem and their role in the regulation of motor activity. So brainstem consists of 3 groups of motor nuclei that receives synaptic contacts and with motor neurons and interneurons of the spinal cord, and they help to form the reflex arc or reflex chain necessary to provide balance and locomotion. So these 3 groups are rubrospinal tract, vestibulospinal tract, and reticulospinal tract. Let's talk about the rubrospinal tract. It begins from the red nucleus and ends on the spinal motor neurons that innervate the flexor muscles of the limbs, mostly distal parts of the body, to opposite side. It's important that it's a key point that it's responsible for the innervation of the opposite side muscles. Parts of its fibers ends on the inhibitory interneuron, due to which muscles extensors are relaxing. This pathway passes through the lateral cords of the spinal white matter and also affect the motor neurons of the spinal cord. Then information goes to the red nucleus from the motor areas of the cerebral cortex and from the cerebellum, which modulate its function and perform complicated forms of motor activity. So the main function of this rubrospinal tract is the movement of our body in space, but it's mainly affect the distal parts of our body than to the proximal parts. There is a special experiment when we make a dissection of the rubrospinal tract between red nucleus and the pons, and when we cut this connection, we will observe specific symptom which is called decerebrate rigidity. And if we perform this experiment on the animal, for example of the cat, we will observe that this cat will stays on the strengthened limbs and loses its ability to move on its own due to the increased tone of extensor muscles. So the main cause of this specific symptom is then that we inactivate motor neurons that's responsible for the innervation of flexor muscles of the distal limb parts by the red nucleus. Next group of nuclei is vestibular nuclei. So there are 4 vestibular nuclei: inferior, superior, lateral, and medial vestibular nuclei. They are located in the pons and the medulla oblongata, and together they form this vestibular complex. So 4 vestibular nuclei. They receive afferent information from the vestibular part of the vestibulocochlear cranial nerve, from the superior colliculi of the corpora quadrigemina, from the cerebellum, and from the reticular formation about the movement of the opposite side of our body. This information is then used for maintaining our body balance, our eye movements when we turn our head or we change our postures, and it's responsible for the formation of nystagmus, so special movement of the eye. The third one group is reticulospinal tract. So the reticular formation of the brainstem contains of 2 groups of nuclei. These are nucleus reticularis pontis oralis and nucleus reticularis pontis caudalis, which are located in the pons. And another one, which is located in the medulla oblongata, is nucleus reticularis gigantocellularis. So 2 reticulospinal pathways begin from these nuclei are pontinic reticulospinal pathway and medullar reticulospinal pathway. They pass ipsilaterally, which means they pass in the same side of our body, in the anterior medial part of the spinal cord white matter. They end mainly on the motor neurons and stimulate the contraction, so-called anti-gravity muscles. So these are muscles of spine and muscles of limbs. And the medullary reticulospinal pathway is a functional antagonist of the pontinic pathway. It stimulates inhibitory interneurons that modulate the activity of motor neurons that innervate extensor muscles. The motor centers of the brainstem include substantia nigra, which is considered to be the part of the extrapyramidal system and is very important in the regulation of the motor activity. It works together with the basal ganglia, and as a result, we will get fine, precise movement that requires prior training. It was established that in synaptic endings of neurons, which originate from the substantia nigra, dopamine is secreted as the mediator. So the lack of the dopamine will lead to the violation of the interaction of the substantia nigra with the basal ganglia and will cause such disease, which is called Parkinson's disease. The main symptoms of this disease is inability to perform precise movements, rigidity of the muscles, mimic disorder, and tremor. Pharmacological agents that is used for treatment of this disease involves such drugs that are responsible for enhanced biosynthesis of dopamine. And examples of such drugs can be levodopa. Except the except those motor nuclei, there are other nuclei which are located of these some cranial nerves, and they take part of the regulation of skeletal muscles as well, mainly located in the head and neck. So let's briefly look through these cranial nerves and the nuclei. So third cranial nerve, which is oculomotor nerve. Its function is chiefly motor nerves, and it's responsible for innervation of somatic motor fibers to 4 of the 6 extrinsic eye muscles that help direct eyeball and to levator palpebrae superior's muscle, which rises upper eyelid. It also has parasympathetic motor fibers to sphincter papillae, which cause pupil to constrict, and to ciliary muscle, controlling lens shape for visual focusing. And it has also sensory afferents, which run from same 4 extrinsic eye muscles to midbrain. Next one is fourth cranial nerve, which is trochlear nerve. It's a primary motor nerve. It supplies somatic motor fibers to one of the extrinsic eye muscles, the superior oblique muscle, which passes through the pulley-shaped trochlea. Next one is trigeminal nerves. It has 3 divisions: ophthalmic division, maxillary division, and mandibular divisions. So ophthalmic division is conveys sensory impulses from skin of anterior scalp, upper eyelid and nose, and from nasal cavity, mucosa, cornea, and lacrimal gland. Maxillary division conveys sensory impulses from nasal cavity, mucosa, palate, upper teeth, skin of cheek, upper lip, and lower eyelid. And the third one, mandibular division, it conveys sensory impulses from anterior part of the tongue, lower teeth, skin of chin, temporal region of scalp. And it supplies motor fibers also to proprioceptors fibers from muscles of mastication. 6th cranial nerve, abducens nerve. It's a primary motor nerve, supplies somatic motor fibers to lateral rectus muscle and extrinsic muscle of the eye, convey proprioceptor impulses from same muscle to brain. Facial nerves, 7th cranial nerve. It conveys motor impulses to skeletal muscles of face. It's responsible for formation of our facial expression. It do not send the information to the chewing muscle. And it transmits proprioceptor impulses from same muscles to pons. And it also transmits parasympathetic motor impulses to lacrimal glands, nasal and palatine glands, submandibular and sublingual salivary glands. 9th cranial nerve, glossopharyngeal nerve. It's a mixed nerve. It has sensory and motor function. It innervates part of tongue and pharynx, provides somatic motor fibers to and carry proprioceptor fibers from a superior pharyngeal muscle called stylopharyngeus, which elevates the pharynx in these following processes. And it provides parasympathetic motor fibers to parotid salivary glands as well. 9th cranial nerve, accessory nerve. It's a mixed nerve, but its primary role is motor function. It supplies motor fibers to trapezius and sternocleidomastoideus muscle, which together move neck and head and convey proprioceptor impulses from same muscles. 12th, hypoglossal nerve. It's a mixed nerve, but same as previous, it its primary role is motor function. It carries somatic motor fibers to intrinsic and extrinsic muscles of tongue and proprioceptors fibers from thin muscles to the brainstem. It also controls tongue movements that mix and manipulate food during chewing and contribute to swallowing and speech. Now let's move to the next subtopic, which is function of cerebral cortex. So main areas of the cerebral cortex was listed previously are primary motor zone, which corresponds to the precentral gyrus, premotor zone, which is localized in front of the primary zone, and additional motor zone, which occupies the upper part of the frontal lobe above the premotor zone. Each of these zones has its own topographical correspondence for different muscle groups and their specific regulation. If we look on this picture, which is called motor homunculus, we will see that most of the largest part of this motor homunculus is occupied by the sides that control movement of facial muscles responsible for facial expression, movement of hands, and only 1/3 of this area is responsible for the movement of lower limbs and other part of the body. So this means that the most perfect voluntary control is possible over those muscles that have largest representations by the motor homunculus. Damage to the particular area of the primary motor zone in case of tumor or trauma or hemorrhage is clinically manifested by paresis or paralysis of the same corresponding skeletal muscle. The difference between paresis and paralysis, that paresis is usually refers to a situation where the muscle weakness is partial. And in case of paralysis, it used to refer to situation where the muscle weakness is more severe or complete. And paresis can be classified into monoparesis when one leg or one arm is weakened, paraparesis when both legs are weakened, usually in case of spinal cord damage at the lower level, hemiparesis when one arm and one leg on either side of the body are weakened. This commonly occurs in strokes affecting the upper motor neurons, and tetraparesis or quadriparesis when all 4 limbs are weakened due to cervical cord or spinal cord damage at high level. Neurosurgeons have made the clinical observation that allow to localize special area of the cerebral cortex responsible for some specific motor function. So we can say that in the motor zone, there is an area that regulates fine, precise movement of hands and fingers. And when there is a damage of this premotor zone, these parts of our body will become less coordinated. And this is called motor apraxia. Below premotor zone, there is the motor center that regulates voluntary head turns and eye movements on the opposite side. Even below this zone, there is a Broca area which is responsible for verbal language. If there is a damage of Broca's area, a person will lose ability to speak certain sounds, but he cannot pronounce individual words. So he will not lose the ability to vocalize. Only some certain words will be problem for him. It was called motor apraxia. In case of expressive aphasia, when there is an inability to distinguish the meaning of words, then that occurs when the Wernicke zone is damaged, then it calls the receptive aphasia. So in case of, once again, in case of damage of Wernicke zone, we will observe receptive aphasia. In case of damage of Broca's area, we will observe expressive aphasia. Now let's talk about the main motor pathways. First one is the corticospinal tract, which begins from the primary motor cortex. Most of its fibers cross over at the level of medulla oblongata. Then it goes down to the spinal cord as part of lateral cords. And the smaller part of the fibers passes the spinal cord without an intersection in the anterior cords of the ipsilateral body side. The corticospinal tract provides a conscious control of the spinal motor neurons, which innervate the skeletal muscles of the limb distal parts, responsible for precise movement. Along with the corticospinal tract, deeply in the cerebral hemispheres, the corticobulbar tract transmits information from the motor cortex to motor and interneurons of the brainstem motor nuclei, and responsible for the movement of muscles of eyeball, tongue, pharynx, facial expression, and chewing muscles. Basal ganglia and their motor function. What is the basal ganglia? It's a cluster of nuclei consisting of gray matter in the deep layer of the white matter of the cerebral hemispheres. There is a list of basal ganglia, but the most important are the corpus striatum, which consists of the caudate nucleus and lentiform nucleus, which in turn includes a putamen and globus pallidum. A claustrum is located lateral to the corpus striatum. Neurons of basal ganglia nuclei receive information from the premotor zone of the cerebral cortex. Then they process this information and return back to the primary motor zone. After that, information from primary motor zone goes to the motor neurons of the spinal cord by the help of the corticospinal tract and perform its movement by the contraction of skeletal muscles. And this process is involved function of the thalamus and some other structures of the brain, such as substantia nigra and subthalamic nuclei. This is integration is necessary for performance of complex movement that needs conscious understanding and which is programmed by the cerebral cortex. It is established that a special role in the realization of voluntary motor movement is played by the claustrum, which receives mainly descending signals from the premotor zone. And the axons of this structure end on the inhibitory synapses on the neurons of basal ganglia nuclei, and the result is a releasing of GABA, inhibitory mediator. So this inhibitory effect of GABA can suppress the activity of neurons that are irrelevant for this particular motor reaction. There are two types of illness that involves violation of the caudate nucleus, and the result will be violation of motor activity. One of them is known as Huntington disease, which is clinically manifested by chorea. Chorea, it's a hyperkinetic syndrome characterized by rapid, uncontrolled, convulsive movements. And the cause of this disease is the degeneration of the caudate nucleus. You can see it on this MRI scans. And if caudate nucleus is damaged, then we will observe loss of this inhibitory effect, so loss of releasing of GABA. And that's why a person will get this uncontrolled, convulsive, and rapid movement because of the lack of this inhibition. And the second disease, which we already told, is Parkinson's disease. It has opposite symptoms and characterized by rigidity of the muscles, difficulties with the onset of voluntary movements, masked face, and tremor. Function of cerebellum. What are the function of cerebellum in the performance of motor activity? So the afferent information that enters from spinal cord to the cerebellum through the spinocerebellar, vestibular cerebellar, olivocerebellar, and cortico-pontocerebellar tracts. Then this information goes to this cortex by the cerebellum thalamic cortical pathways to the red nucleus, as well as to the vestibular nucleus and reticular formation by the help of cerebellar reticular pathway. We should note that almost all efferent effects of the cerebellum on other structures are also inhibitory. So cerebellum receives direct information from the motor cortex and red nucleus about the actions about the action which is planned, and then helps to process performing of this movement. A copy of this information enters to the motor neurons of spinal cord through the corticospinal tract. If the result of planned action and performed movement is not the same, then corrective information from the cerebellum comes to the motor cortex and red nucleus, which increase or decrease some central nervous system structures, which directly control the contraction of muscles. In other words, cerebellum corrects the function of cerebral cortex and red nucleus, specifying the necessary force, sequence, and speed of movement. So cerebellum plays an important role in the regulating of muscle tone, maintaining posture, coordination of muscles antagonists, and provide tonic, smooth muscle contraction. If there is a damage of cerebellum, we can observe several symptoms, which are, for example, ataxia. It's a lack of movement coordination, loss of consistency between muscle contractions of synergists and antagonists. Next one is dysmetry. It's a disturbance of the movement's amplitude. So person cannot control amplitude of its movement. He can usually overact by the movements of his skeletal muscles. And adiadochokinesia, it's the inability to perform synchronous movements with symmetrical limbs. So a person cannot move his two hands symmetrically. Now let's move to the last subtopic of today's lecture, which is anatomical functional features of the peripheral department of the autonomic nervous system. So main function of the autonomic nervous system is to regulate function of internal organs according to the parameters from internal and external environment. And autonomic nervous system consists of autonomic nerve fibers that innervate internal organs, peripheral nodes that contain the clusters of neuron bodies, autonomic centers of the spinal cord, the medulla oblongata, and the midbrain, and higher autonomic centers located in the hypothalamus and the limbic system. The one main difference between the autonomic nervous system and somatic nervous system, that this system cannot be controlled consciously. The peripheral part of the autonomic nervous system also has some special features, which are presence of synaptic rupture at the level of autonomic ganglia. And by the help of this, the autonomic nervous system maintains a certain autonomy and is able to regulate the functions of the internal organs, even if even of the absence of integration with the centers of the brain. And the next feature is lack of a clear segmented structure. So autonomic neuronal axons originate from the limited parts of the spinal cord and brain and are widely branched throughout the periphery, not only within 2-3 neighboring segments. Now let's talk in detail about sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system, about its structure. So sympathetic nervous system. So preganglionic neurons of the synaptic nervous system originate in the region of gray matter in the thoracic and upper lumbar region called the lateral horn. Pre and postganglionic neurons are communicate in 3 patterns. So first, most of the preganglionic neurons synapse with postganglionic in bilateral sympathetic ganglia, which form a sympathetic chain or truncus sympathicus, sympathetic chain. The preganglionic neuron is myelinated, and the axons of these form the white ramus or white branch as they connect to the ganglia. The postganglionic neurons are unmyelinated and they leave the ganglion as the gray ramus, which rejoins the spinal nerves. Because the axons of the preganglionic neurons may branch and travel up and down the sympathetic chain, a single preganglionic neuron can synapse with many postganglionic neurons up and down the sympathetic chain. So the effect of this stimulation is widespread. Second pattern is a group of long preganglionic neurons innervate modified postganglionic cells in the adrenal medulla called chromaffin cell. These cells release epinephrine and norepinephrine and a small amount of dopamine in response to this stimulation. And the third pattern is that the part of preganglionic neurons synapse with postganglionic neurons in collateral ganglia. These preganglionic neurons leave the spinal nerve through the white rami, but do not synapse with neurons in the sympathetic chain and continue to the collateral ganglia. So there are three types of ganglia: solar plexus, superior and inferior mesenteric plexuses. The main function is to innervate abdominal and pelvic organs. Parasympathetic division. The preganglionic neurons originate in the brainstem or sacral spinal cord and are relatively long. The preganglionic neurons synapse with postganglionic neurons in ganglia near the effector organ or in the wall of the effector organ, or in the wall of effector organ. So cranial nerve nuclei are in the brainstem and travel with the cranial nerves 3rd, 7, 9, and 10. The 10 cranial nerve, which is vagus nerve, innervates much of the visceral organs, including lung, heart, stomach, small intestine, and liver. The parasympathetic neurons that originate from the sacral spinal cord join to form distinct pelvic nerves. Now let's talk about synaptic transmission in the autonomic nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system uses two types of neurotransmitters. Acetylcholine is the most common. Neurons that release it are called cholinergic neurons. Cholinergic neurons include all preganglionic neurons of the autonomic nervous system, postganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic nervous system, and some postganglionic neurons, like sweat glands, of the sympathetic nervous system. And second neurotransmitter is norepinephrine, which is released by the neurons which are called adrenergic. And almost all sympathetic postganglionic neurons are adrenergic. There are two types of cholinergic receptors and also some subtypes of adrenergic receptors. So let's look through the cholinergic receptors, which are nicotinic and muscarinic. Nicotinic receptors are found on the cell bodies and dendrites of preganglionic sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons, on chromaffin cells of the adrenal medulla, and on the skeletal muscle cells. They associated with cation channels that allow both potassium and sodium ions to pass through, and they're responsible for depolarization of postsynaptic cell. Second one, muscarinic receptors are found on effector organs of the parasympathetic nervous system. These receptors are coupled with G protein, and they can be both inhibitory and excitatory. Adrenergic receptors are divided into alpha and beta types. Alpha is subdivided into alpha 1 and alpha 2, Beta is subdivided into beta 1, beta 2, and beta 3 adrenergic receptors. They are also coupled with G protein and triggers release of calcium. Let's talk about the effects of the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems on the various tissues. So most of the effectors of the autonomic nervous system receive double innervation from both sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. In a rest state, the effects of parasympathetic regulation dominate over the sympathetic. But under the influence of the stress factors or psycho-emotional stress, for example, the influence of sympathetic division begins to dominate. And in most of the tissues, effects of sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions are opposite. So if you look into the heart, we will see that sympathetic division increase heart rate and force of contraction, parasympathetic decrease heart rate. In case of blood vessels, sympathetic constrict and dilate, and as we see that this type of tissue do not have double innervation, same as sweat glands and salivary glands. So some of the tissues do not get double innervation. When sympathetic division is activated, we said it's mostly during the stress situation. What we will observe, heart rate will increase, pupil will dilate, movement of gastrointestinal tract will decrease, and adrenal glands start to secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine. Special key point about the double innervation of autonomic nervous system on salivary gland, that both of them stimulate synthesis of saliva, but it leads to the different characteristics of the quality of this saliva. So when sympathetic nervous system affects salivary gland, it starts to secrete thick saliva, and parasympathetic increase secretion of watery saliva. It explains why in the case of stress, we feel that our mouth is dry. And the last subtopic for today is the higher autonomic centers, which are located in the brainstem, hypothalamus, and limbic system. The nuclei of the reticular formation of the brainstem take part in the regulation of respiration, circulation, and digestion. The hypothalamus is considered to be the highest nervous center, autonomic center, which is responsible for stability of the internal environment of our organism. It contains 48 pairs of nuclei that are anatomically divided into groups: preoptic, anterior, middle, posterior, and lateral. Functionally, they are divided into two groups: specific nuclei and non-specific ones. Specific nuclei are connected with the pituitary gland and capable of neurosecretion. So it secretes hypothalamic neurons, which are called releasing factors. We will talk about them when we will have endocrine functions, endocrine chapter. The hypothalamic nuclei are involved in the activation of the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions, depending on the afferent information that comes to them. In the middle group of the hypothalamus nuclei, there are special neurons that can control the chemical composition of the blood passing through them. These are osmotic receptors, glucose receptors, and thermal receptors. So hypothalamus receives information about the state of the internal organs, not only by the nervous way, but also by the help of humoral way. The efferent impulses from the hypothalamus affect the autonomic centers of the lower order, like preganglionic neurons of sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. In addition, they have prolonged regulation mechanism by the help of pituitary stimulation, and that is why hypothalamus is considered as the main, the higher center for regulation action of the internal environment. The center of hunger and satiety, water salt balance, thermal regulation are located in the hypothalamus. The limbic system consists of the mammillary bodies of the hypothalamus, the anterior nuclei of the thalamus, amygdaloid body, cingulate gyrus, hippocampus, formix, and septal nuclei. This is the part of limbic system. And this complex is responsible mainly for mechanisms of emotional behavior and its autonomic support. So I thank you for your attention, and this is all for today's lecture.